Cracking the Code, The Fascinating Truth About Taxation in America by Peter Eric Hendrickson. What you will learn in Cracking the Code, that the vast majority of the Internal Revenue Code, IRC, is not the law itself, but is only evidence, a representation of the actual statutes in force. And like in the game of post office, the real language has been a bit garbled in transmission. That income, wages, self-employment income, employee, employer, and trade or business, as these and certain other terms are used within and in regard to the tax law, have narrow legal meanings exclusively involving and applying to certain privileged activities, such as holding or administering a government office or working in one. That although the tax statutes make perfectly clear that, for instance, language describing the obligations of employees and the taxes to which employees are subject only apply to a small minority of American workers, the distinction is artfully concealed in the IRC representation of the law, and is never forthrightly acknowledged in any IRS publication, although it is obliquely acknowledged whenever necessary for the avoidance of legal jeopardy. That an elaborate system has been created which causes some people to whom the tax laws do not otherwise apply, maybe including you, to inadvertently declare themselves to be among the persons to whom those laws do apply. Quote, the revenue laws are a code or system in regulation of tax assessment and collection. They relate to taxpayers and not to non-taxpayers. The latter are without their scope. End quote. United States Court of Claims, Economy, Plumbing, and Heating versus United States. Which one are you? I don't know what you mean by glory, Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant there's a nice knockdown argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument, Alice objected. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master? That's all. Foreword. Let's get this said loud and clear right at the outset. If you have a taxable income, you are subject to the income tax. Section 1A of the Internal Revenue Code says, quote, there is hereby imposed on the taxable income of a tax of varying percentages, end quote. Pretty straightforward. Of course, it does raise the question of exactly what is taxable income. Quote, we must reject the broad contention submitted in behalf of the government that all receipts, everything that comes in, are income, end quote. United States Supreme Court, South Pacific vs. Lowe. Quote, inclusio unius est exclusio alterius. The inclusion of one is the exclusion of another. The certain designation of one person is an absolute exclusion of all others. This doctrine decrees that where law expressly describes a particular situation to which it shall apply, an irrefutable inference must be drawn that what is omitted or excluded was intended to be omitted or excluded, end quote. Black's Law Dictionary, 6th edition. It was not until the late 1900s, when the Internal Revenue Code was digitized and thus made searchable, that it became possible to decipher its deliberately confusing and misleading construction. Only then could complete searches be done of all 3,413,780 or so words, not counting regulations, for every incidence of liable, imposed, income, employee, and dozens of other key or misleading terms, checking every reference, exception, definition, and source. Only then could it be established that, as written, the laws behind the code and the taxes that they impose technically comply with the Constitution, just as all the judges have said over the years. But the same analysis also reveals that, as written, these laws don't apply to most of the receipts of most private citizens. Indeed, the two things are interdependent. The former couldn't be true unless the latter was also true. What you will learn as you read this book is that specific constitutional limitations on the federal government's power to tax do shape related law and have generated a coherent Supreme Court doctrine which clearly and soundly answers the question of what is taxable income. Both the statutes and the doctrine acknowledge the exemption of the vast majority of private sector receipts from that taxing power's reach. However, you will also learn about a complex combination of craft, routine bureaucratic incoherence, and casual and not so casual corruption, by virtue of which many people are led to inadvertently allow and even participate in the legal transformation of their untaxable earnings into taxable income. Such people are tricked into voluntarily and utterly unnecessarily enabling the diversion of a river of wealth from their own hands, usually never to be seen again. Thanks to an unhappy coincidence of reiterations and amendments of the law, a series of complicated judicial rulings, and the passage of time and memories, the details of American tax law and the principles upon which it is based have come to be widely misunderstood. The opportunities presented by that reality have been seized upon by those paid to maximize revenue flow to the government to successfully construct an elaborate and deceptive tax scheme rooted in today's Internal Revenue Code. This scheme capitalizes on widespread public ignorance of general legal doctrine and rules of statutory construction. It practices a careful gauging of extraction levels to the tolerance limits of key demographic segments. It relies upon the concealment of the underlying actual law enforced behind the misleading words of the code, which is legally no more than evidence of the law and not the law itself. Fundamental to the scheme is designing that code to be so dauntingly and profoundly confusing as to force the vast majority of those against whom it's directed to abandon even a pretense of personal comprehension. These targets are thus compelled to surrender their decision-making to the code's administrative bureaucracy or a professional class of fixers and go-betweens, the members of either of which are dependent on the scheme for their own earnings. Unsurprisingly, both assure any who ask that, of course, private sector receipts are taxed under the law. If pressed, these experts will trot out carefully selected, out of context, and ambiguous fragments of law calculated to convincingly suggest that what they claim must be in the law somewhere. But somehow they never manage to demonstrate exactly where. Cracking the code is going to provide that missing context, unravel the tangle of deceit and confusion, and make clear that not only is it not in there anywhere, what is in there is just the opposite. Plainly stated, the income tax scheme is an utterly corrupt and corrosive fraud, feeding an ever more insatiable appetite of a swollen cadre of politically astute private interests and their camp followers, by way of a deliberate campaign of disinformation, intimidation, and cunning. It facilitates almost incomprehensible harm to the well-being of all the rest of us, both by the nature and peripheral effects of its implementation, and by the practices and policies which the wealth it transfers make possible. It is my hope that this book will bring the reader to share that view, and to help in some small way to arm those who'd rather keep or control the disposition of their own property with the knowledge by which to do so. It is also my hope that the reader will agree that in this instance, as is the case in so many others, looking after our own interest serves those of society as well. It was not, after all, for idle reasons that the founders imposed strict constitutional limitations on the taxing power of the federal government, nor was it merely to protect their own property. Such limitations are essential to meaningful security and the preservation of liberty. As John Adams said, quote, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence." End quote. The reader will observe a predisposition of focus throughout this book on receipts from labor, either traded as an embedded worker, common law employee, or as a freelance worker, contractor, as opposed to receipts in the form of interest derived from capital and the like. This is because such receipts from work represent far and away both the biggest pool of wealth and the biggest pool of citizens from which taxes are scammed away. Some will object to this statistical assertion, having read 100 times about how the wealthy, read coupon-clipping fat cats, pay a grossly disproportionate share of the tax burden, and one amounting to the lion's share of the total. These urban legends are reflective of the misunderstandings essential to the success of the tax scheme. While the wealthy, read persons who have produced considerable value for their neighbors and have been paid a corresponding amount of money, do indeed pay a disproportionate share, as if anything their demand on the public expense is less than that of others, the aggregate percentage of the total tax extraction paid by households with annual receipts over $200,000 is less than one-third of the total. A significant contributor to the erroneous assertions in this regard is a failure to understand the FICA contributions are nothing more than income taxes, indistinguishable, both legally and practically, from any other, something which will be discussed in greater detail as we proceed. By themselves, such contributions, every penny of which is paid by workers, made up more than 34% of the total federal tax extraction in 2001. Source, OMB. However, those readers for whom interest, dividends, and similar receipts are of paramount concern should note that every principle and point regarding the lawful nature of taxable income found herein also apply to that class of receipt. end will find them and the information about the structure and nature of the tax laws illuminating, invigorating, and utilitarian. Managers of non-federal corporations and other artificial persons should keep in mind that although the focus of this book is primarily on the application of the income tax to natural persons, the meaning of income is the same for both kinds of persons. Those who have studied the general subject of taxation in America will note the absence of discussion herein of several revenue acts, as well as various amendments, reforms, and repeals involving the same subject. This book is not intended to be a general exploration of revenue legislation through the years. Rather, it is a study of the lawful scope of any such legislation, whenever and however promulgated, and the particulars of such legislation as is currently extant, to which certain Americans are or can be made subject, and how these things happen. Enactments which predate the current IRC are selected on the basis of their virtue in clarifying current language therein, which is otherwise misleading or unclear. Positive enactments which are incorporated into the IRC are presented in their current form. Emphasis is occasionally added to portions of quotes, cites, and excerpts without additional notice. Clarity obliges the often annoying use of quotation marks, bracketing certain terms. I don't do this because I like to. It is to distinguish custom-defined legal terms from the common words which they mimic, and for which they might otherwise be mistaken. Such mistakes are a large part of the difficulty many people have in comprehending the truth of the tax scheme, and therefore such clarification is imperative. Please forgive. Finally, nothing in this book should be construed or relied upon as particular advice or instructions for any particular reader. Each reader must make his or her own independent determination of how the nature, meaning, and application of any law affects himself or herself. A searchable current Internal Revenue Code can be found at http://www.law.cornell.edu, and the associated regulations can be found at www.access.gpo.gov. Statutes from the years 1789 to 1875 can be found at memory.loc.gov. Others can be seen at any decent law library. The text of most Supreme and lower court rulings can be found at www.findlaw.com. Additional material on the subject of taxes and other matters of law and public policy can be found on my website, www.losthorizons.com.